you to tonight's Weil Lecture on American Citizenship with Mr. Barney Frank. The Institute for the Arts and Humanities serves as UNC's faculty home for conversation and collaboration across the disciplines. Its mission is to help the university recruit, refresh, develop, and retain a world-class faculty of scholars and teachers. At the heart of this mission is the affirmation of the crucial value of the arts and humanities to the life of the university and the world. We at the IAH are proud to be the stewards of the Weil Lecture on American Citizenship. The IAH has hosted this biennial lecture since 2000, but the series is in fact much older. We are delighted to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the Weil Lecture this year. William Howard Taft gave the very first Weil Lecture in 1915. Yes, for all you Taft fans out there. So Taft, a Republican, served as the 27th President of the United States and the 10th Chief Justice of the United States. Over the next century, a series of important public figures gave the Weil Lecture, among them Eleanor Roosevelt, Jimmy Carter, Cornel West, John Kerry, and most recently, John Huntsman. The Weil Lecture is just one of the many contributions to the university by the Weil family. Brothers Henry, Solomon, and Herman Weil left Germany sometime before 1859 and set up a business as wagon peddlers in Goldsboro, just about 90 miles southeast of here. Ever since they arrived in this country, the Weil family has embraced a tradition of philanthropy and community involvement. Weils have been elected officials, as well as early leaders in women's suffrage, civil rights, and historic preservation. Weils have donated funds and land to create parks, a library, a synagogue, a theater, a hospital, and much more. They have also served as trustees at UNC Chapel Hill and have supported our medical, information and library science, and business schools. For this and much more, the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill is deeply grateful. We have about 30 members of the extended Weil family with us today, and I'd like for us to take a moment to thank them. So I've asked Mr. Buck Goldstein to introduce our distinguished speaker tonight. Buck Goldstein is university entrepreneur in residence and a professor of the practice in the economics department. He's also a proud graduate of this university, where he was elected to the Phi Beta Kappa and the Order of the Golden Fleece, the university's highest honorary society. More pertinent to tonight's event, however, he was the founding board chair of the Institute for the Arts and Humanities and has known Mr. Frank for, I believe, about 20 years now. Before I hand things over to him, however, I want to inform you that Mr. Frank will be signing copies of his recent memoir, Frank, A Life in Politics from the Great Society to Same-Sex Marriage. And this will take place in the lobby shortly after the lecture. So now I'd like to welcome Mr. Buck Goldstein to the podium.
How's everybody tonight? Good. I've been looking forward to this evening for a long time because I get to talk about two of my favorite things, the Institute for the Arts and Humanities and Barney Frank. So a word about the Institute. Many of you, as I look around, probably know about it, but the Institute for Arts and Humanities is really a minor miracle. It is the child of a religion professor, Professor Rule Tyson, who believed that the arts and humanities and our faculty were at the heart and soul of this university. And from a brown bag lunch, he hatched Hyde Hall. And Hyde Hall is the first new building on the old quad since the Moorhead Planetarium. It in itself, a minor miracle. But more importantly, it symbolizes the commitment that this place has to teaching. The purpose of the arts of the Institute is to identify and then keep our very best faculty, because we all know that that is what makes us tick. And as I was talking to Barney earlier, he recounted that when he was teaching at Harvard, one of the highlights was having Frank Graham come talk to his students, who is a great, as you all know, our great president and great professor here. So the Institute really stands for everything that we believe, the arts and humanities and great teaching. And we've had great leadership since Professor Tyson, John McGowan, and now Mark. We should all be very, very grateful to the Institute for the Arts and Humanities. Hear, hear. So in some ways, that's the easy part. Mark asked me to do this, and I thought to myself, how do you introduce Barney Frank? First of all, he doesn't believe in notes. Secondly, he's very funny. Third, he's very smart. And fourth, you already all know who he is. So the smart money says you should sit down right now. And I'm not going to go through his biography, but if those of you don't know who he is, take out your phone, look at Wikipedia. There's a great, I'm sure, a great bio. I'm not going to do that. But what I do want to do is to tell a couple of stories, personal stories, about Barney, and beginning with, first I think I want to make him feel at home. So, you know, you've come to what's now unfortunately become kind of a red state, North Carolina, purple sometimes, blue a while ago, and, you know, so how do we make him feel at home? And I thought maybe the best way is to quote Jesse Helms. Now, you might think that that's a non sequitur. Barney once said of Jesse that he believed that life began at conception and ended at birth. However, there was a quote that many of you know that I think will make Barney feel more at home, because Jesse was talking about Chapel Hill in the context of a major expenditure that was about to take place in this state, involving the state zoo. And Jesse was, of course, against. I think at that point he was just a commentator on WRAL, right, Channel 5. And he said, you know, we don't need a state zoo. We can just put a fence around Chapel Hill. So welcome to Chapel Hill. So the three stories. The first one was that I was a student here, graduated in 1970, and my first job was at Yale, working for a man named Joel Fleischman, who was a very good friend of Barney's. And I was the internship director, and we had interns in Boston. And there was another man whose office was down the hall from mine, who was a very illustrious graduate of UNC named Al Lowenstein. And many of you know Al, and those of you who don't, especially the students, look him up. He's really one of the great, as Barney said at dinner, unknown or less known great Americans who had a huge impact on the world, graduate of UNC, led the Dump Johnson movement, and helped with help from a lot of students unseat a sitting president. So Al said, you need to go to Boston for one of those seminars because you need to meet Barney Frank. So if Al Lowenstein tells you to do something, you do it. I went to Boston and thought, oh my God, Barney was leading a seminar for about 12 undergraduates. I was just barely graduated, and I thought there was only one Al Lowenstein, and now there's this other guy who's actually like Al Lowenstein, except he's much more practical. He's going to really make stuff happen. And that was, you were very kind to say 20 years ago, because it was probably more like 40 years ago. But it was the first time I met Barney, and I immediately knew that this guy was something special. So the second story is that Barney kept doing what he did, which was to know more than anyone else in the room, to do his homework, to show up every day, and to work as hard as he absolutely could on the things that he believed in. And when you do that, sometimes history converges in a way that allows you to have an impact way beyond anything you might ever dream of and change the world. And that's exactly what happened during the financial meltdown, because we had a congressman who was chair of the House Finance Committee who actually understood what was going on, that we were on the brink of a serious depression, not recession, but depression, that strong action had to be taken, and that subsequently there would have to be major reform that deleveraged our financial institutions so that they couldn't play with high leverage in the good times and have taxpayers bail them out in the bad times. So we had a man who was particularly suited for that job because he had worked so hard for so long to understand the Congress, to understand the issues, and because he was just basically a smart guy. Now, it's not that he was a politician. One of his staff members said, "You have to love Barney in order to like him." And he himself said, anyone who says you like campaigning, that they like campaigning, is either lying or they're a psychopath. So Barney was not a born politician, but he did his job. He did it extraordinarily well, and the country is very, very lucky that Barney Frank was sitting in Congress at the moment in time when we were in real distress and needed leadership like his. So the third and last story is that just to bring you up to date, okay, so this took place in August of this past year. Barney was talking about his book at the Martha's Vineyard Book Festival, and he was very calm, and his book, he said he's now chilling and he's living the good life and he's becoming a better and better person, and it all sounded great, except, you're sort of missing the old Barney fire and brimstone Frank. And someone put up their hand during his talk and said, "Congressman, I personally blame you for all the problem, for the housing crisis, that you pumped up Jenny Mae and Fannie Mae in an incredibly irresponsible way, and you caused the housing crisis." And I heard someone behind me who was one of his constituents said, "This is gonna be really good." And it was. I wish I could have filmed it. This guy, who was very cocky, was dismantled in about 5 or 8 minutes, and it reminded me, and I'm reminding you, that notwithstanding all this stuff about the good life and Barney being a kinder, gentler Barney Frank, when you take him on, he's still Barney Frank, and he did it today on TV, apparently, when he was interviewed about Jeb Bush thinking that they should repeal the Dodd-Frank bill. So Barney is still Barney, and I can't wait for all of you and all of us now to get a dose of Barney Frank.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you. Thank you to Mark, and I'm not too loud here. We have the 2 mics. How are we now? How's this? All right. I was very glad to be. I knew those 2 mics was not going to work well, guys. We have it now? Okay. As I said, I was happy for the invitation. I have a really important message that I want to give. I thank Buck for his very kind words. I guess was it Mark Buck said you could look me up in Wikipedia. I've never done that myself. I must say I am, as I understand the model there, I'm very skeptical of it. And I believe that the internet is, among other things, the greatest transmitter of misinformation in the history of mankind. It seems to me that to a great extent, it crowdsources ignorance. But whatever it says, please be a little skeptical. Although I'm told it's basically favorable. The title is a little awkward, but I was pleased, and I want to join in thanking the Weil family for their sponsorship of this important contribution to public debate and for things in general at the university. I like the notion of citizenship. Now, I have a goal more than any other left in my approach to public policy. I am convinced that the prerequisite for our being able to increase the quality of life in the United States is a substantial reduction in our military budget. And that comes from a substantial reduction in things you use a military budget for in part, and others for things that you just have it around as a security blanket. And the question is, okay, but this is supposed to be about citizenship, but here is the nexus, and it's one that I talk about in the book. We are in a situation now in America where public belief in the value of citizenship is at an all-time low. People dislike government, and it's been that way for a while, but now we have very graphic evidence in it, in the inherent implausibility of the three leading Republican candidates for president of the United States. Now, I am a partisan, and I believe that partisanship is an important part of politics, but I never said that before. I didn't say it about John McCain or even Mitt Romney. I wouldn't have said it about Bob Dole. But leading off with Donald Trump and Ben Carson is just ridiculous if you're talking about any rational standard of governance. By the way, both of them get away with, thanks in part to the media, posing as straight-talking people when they hedge and fudge and tap dance as much as any politician. Ben Carson was asked about his comment that it would be lame to raise the minimum wage, and his response was, people should go look it up. Well, you probably could. Well, possibly you could. No, we'd have to get a group of experts together to decide. He had obviously blurted out this right-wing trope, then he was told it might be a problem. Similarly with Donald Trump, he has changed position almost as much as he has changed partners. The fact is, this man, he is now taking these right-wing positions because they are popular within the Republican Party. They directly contradict what he said before. That happens, but how he gets away with being the man who talks straight is hard to understand. Clearly, what's at issue here, now it's even worse on the Republican side, but even on the Democratic side, you have a general public unhappiness with government. On the first page of my book, I sketch out this trajectory of my career. When I was 14, I wanted to get involved in government. I wanted to change things for the better in this society. I was angry at things. Racism was a big part of it. The murder of Emmett Till, a 14-year-old from Chicago and Mississippi, was a part of it. Joseph McCarthy, then rampant. So I wanted to change things, but I knew that to change things the way I wanted, the best thing to do was to get into government. I couldn't wait to be a citizen. On the other hand, as I said in the book, I was a kind of a normal teenager, and like the other guys, I liked sports and bad food and loud music. But there was one thing that did differentiate me from the other guys, which was that I liked them too, in ways that they did not. And so the question is, okay, I'd like to be in government so I could be influential in changing the world, but I'm a homosexual, as we then said, so I probably never will get an influential position. as time went on, there were two changes. The prejudice against my sexuality diminished substantially to the point where I was able to get into government, at first somewhat covertly, by the mid-'80s as a openly acknowledged gay man. And so being gay, and particularly by the time the financial crisis came around, Buck talked about it, my being gay was no obstacle to my becoming influential in government. The problem was that government was no longer influential in society. So, you know, I got the car keys, but there was no gas. And that's why I get to the end of the book. In fact, as an example of this, in my last years in Congress, I did two things that will be noted in history. One, in both cases, I collaborated with another man. In one case, Chris Dodd and I led the passage of a major overhaul of financial regulation. Secondly, my husband Jim and I get married. Jim's sitting here with us. And so there were these two things I did, and unthinkable when I was younger, first because I was gay and because that would be an obstacle. By 2012, I was told, I never polled this myself, I would not have polled on the subject of my marriage, but I was told reliably that of the two collaborations I had with other men, with Jim getting married, with Chris passing the reform bill, my marriage was much more the popular of the two. That my marrying another man had a much higher degree of approval than reforming the financial architecture in America. I have since told Chris Dodd that probably we're not going to hang around as much, and I'll just spend more time with Jim from the standpoint of popularity. So this is very frustrating to me. How do we restore people's view that government is a worthy instrument for good? And that, of course, that's part of the citizenship. You cannot persuade people of the virtues of citizenship if they do not believe that the government's any good. What's the point of being an active, informed participant in your government if you think the government sucks? So that's what, then the question is, how do you restore people's view that government can be important? And the historical trajectory here again is sketched out by three presidents. In 1961, John Kennedy's famous statement was, ask what you can do for your country. That's a very communitarian statement that is based on the view that government is important and you participate in it. 20 years later, the signature statement of Ronald Reagan, who, by the way, is the next really popular president, because, interesting, there are 5 presidents between John Kennedy and Ronald Reagan. Every one of them leaves office involuntarily. Johnson, Nixon, Ford, Carter, all go without wanting to. And what happens is Ronald Reagan comes in and says, government is not the answer to our problems. Government is the problem. Absolutely antithetical views. And unfortunately, the Reagan view begins to get popular. And then, and I did not realize how bad things were from my standpoint until Bill Clinton comes in. And I admired Bill Clinton, and I'm proud to have worked with him. But he breaks the tie between John Kennedy's ask what you can do for your country and Ronald Reagan's government is a problem, because his big statement in the State of the Union message is, the era of big government is over. And that's a good thing. I complained to some of his staff afterwards that I felt like, did I sleep through the era of big government? How can it be over when it never happened? Unless we were talking about 1937, which I don't think they were talking about. I mean, this was the tiebreaker. Now, I think Clinton made the mistake, and people who are his allies, of thinking that you could kind of split the baby, that you could be supportive of various government programs in particular while denigrating the notion of government in general. I think that was a very self-defeating strategy. In politics, no more than physically, can the whole be smaller than the sum of the parts? So that brings us to the current situation, because things have deteriorated since then. And among the things that have made it worse is the change in the way people receive information. Newspapers are diminishing. I have given up on one hope that I'd had as a pre-digital kind of Luddite with regard to technology. I was desperately hoping that newspapers would outlive me. I have to report that while I'm getting older, I am in much better health than the newspaper industry, and I am afraid that I will see its demise. And it is certainly the case, while it's available to me, it is much less, not just newspapers, but television news of the old sort. Traditional information is much less the source of what people think and know about government. More and more, they are getting it in bits and pieces from social media, from the internet, and even from media that I'm supposed to feel allied to ideologically. I will tell you that, in my judgment, Jon Stewart and Stephen Colbert are both very funny and partly responsible for the fact that people think government is no good. Because I have watched those shows from time to time. Nothing good has ever been done by any public official on either one of them. And it's not just them, it's entertainment in general. I'm told this very popular program, I watched it a couple of times, House of Cards, about how venal politicians are. It is complete and utter crap. It's not even untrue, it's implausible. But this is part of the problem, that the way you get ahead in the media today is to denigrate government. When's the last time you read or heard or saw any celebration of a public success? When there are successes, they are disregarded. The general pattern is people say terrible things about something contemporaneously, and then if it does work out, then you never hear from it again. Good news becomes no news. The example most recently is Ebola. Barack Obama was being pilloried over Ebola. He wasn't quarantining people at home. He wasn't cutting off immigration from Africa. Oh, this was terrible. We were going to have all kinds of danger. In fact, the American government handled the Ebola situation very, very well. We contained it within the United States. One person died in America of Ebola, and he had caught it somewhere else. And we were a leader in helping Liberia get rid of Ebola. I guarantee you that if there had been an epidemic of deaths from Ebola, you would know much more about its history than most people now know. And my guess is that before I mentioned how successful Ebola had been from the policy standpoint, you hadn't thought about it, because good news disappears. And that's part of the problem. Okay, enough complaining about. By the way, what do you do about it? Well, there was one other element I want to put forward. And there was this model people have of a wonderful, noble group of citizens who was somehow terribly served by this gang of corrupt and incompetent people who have been elected to serve them. And the role of the media is to shine a light on these misdeeds. In fact, this notion of a decent and noble population being ill-served by the people who govern them is just nonsense. The people who govern them were selected by the people who hate them. I mean, I really have to ask, if the public is so unhappy with the people in office, why the hell did they vote for them? Nobody in the United States Congress is there who did not get more votes than anybody else in the last election. And this is part of the problem. It's also true when I blame the media. I understand there's a terrible bias in the media. Partly it's because people don't want to hear good news. One of the problems I have is that there's an incentive for members of the House and the Senate to beat up the government. You rarely hear members of Congress praising any branch of the executive for doing something good. One reason is that when we do that, it's not news, but two, people don't do it as much because that's no way to get in the papers. Or I'm getting old-fashioned, the papers. That's no way to let the public know what you're doing. I do not watch the internet very much, but I guarantee you that there has never been, no clip has gone viral of a senator telling the Secretary of Health and Human Services what a good job she did. What goes viral are the vicious table-pounding attacks. So I think what we have, frankly, is a kind of a menage a trois of the voters, the politicians, and the media, in which they all bring out the worst in each other, and the public blames the politicians. And that's the consequence. That's where we are now. We're worrying whether we can, these days, it is considered a great triumph if the government is allowed to function. And the notion that the government can be a great source for good kind of falls away. Now, there are still specific examples to the contrary. We are making some progress in some areas. But, and it's going to be interesting to see what the reaction is to the Pope's endorsement of a liberal agenda before Congress today. It won't change any votes in the near term because we should be very clear. While politicians talk about how their religion is how they decide to vote, it is very clear overwhelmingly what politicians do is decide how to vote and then go to the religion and sort of cherry pick it to find things that justify you. People like to be able to claim religious sanction for what they do, but if it's not there, they just disregard it. What we have seen in Washington this week is a variant of an old game that kids used to play in the days when young males competed against each other physically rather than virtually. There was a game called Capture the Flag, where you fought over who got to wave the flag. We have seen Washington this past week playing Capture the Pope. And the prize is that you get to wave the papal banner over your agenda and say, see, the Pope's really on my side. But even with some of these individual things, the fundamental problem is that people hate government. Now, here's what happens. Because they hate government, they vote into office increasingly people who also don't like government. And the more they elect people who don't like government, the worse the government is, and the more they don't like it. And therefore, the more they vote for people who hate it. And by the way, let me talk about gridlock and political dysfunction. Yes, we have gridlock, we have political dysfunction, and it's not because there is a breakdown in the system or that there is some fault on both sides. I was the chairman of the Financial Services Committee, as Buck mentioned, in 2008, and I appreciate his praise for the job I did, and people have said, well, isn't it a good thing you happened to be there at that time? And I'm a great believer in the system, but I do want to acknowledge, yes, I happened to be there at that time to be the chairman because of my talent, my skill, other people's appreciation of me, the fact that one guy died, one guy got defeated, and another guy just quit. Because I got to be the chairman of the committee on seniority. It had nothing to do, there was a great quote from Lord Melbourne, who was a British aristocrat in the 19th century, and he really hated the democratization that was coming in England. And he liked the old ways. And somebody said something about the Order of the Garter, and he said, well, I'll tell you what I like about the Order of the Garter. There's no damn nonsense about merit when they give it out. There was no damn nonsense about merit when I became chairman. That's just the way the system works. But we were Democrats in power. And George Bush sent his top economic appointees to us and said, the economy is about to dissolve. Unless you do something, Buck alluded to this, that is, everybody's going to hate. Putting money through the banks to keep them from going away. I believe that history will show that the TARP program, which we gave, the Democrats passed at George Bush's request, with Republican support in the Senate, not in the House, when they voted against it. We knew that we were passing something that people didn't like. I now believe it will go down in history as the most highly successful, overwhelmingly unpopular thing the government ever did. The frustration for us is that by using government effectively in a bipartisan way to forestall the economic crisis, which had been brought about by bad government, i.e. no regulation, we made people angrier. And so we now are in a situation where people get elected in 2010 and take over the House of Representatives and gain strength in the Senate and now take it over, who don't believe in government. And when the government is run by people who don't believe in government, it doesn't function very well. So this is the dilemma. I believe the solution requires some analysis. Why are so many people mad at government, lost faith in government, angry, not just lost, why are they so angry? Some are people who just don't believe in government, philosophical libertarians. They are very few. The problem, the shift in American politics comes, I believe, as you look over the post-war period, from people who demographically used to vote Democratic and now vote Republican because they hate government, and the Republicans are more the government haters. That's, on the whole, white working class men. Men who are in the economy without highly developed skills, without technological abilities, without higher education. And I understand why they are angry. Their position has eroded within the economy. They are angry at government, not because they are philosophically opposed to the government, but I believe precisely because they believe that government could have helped them if it wanted to. That if the people in power really cared about them, the government would have helped them. These are people who knew about the New Deal and even about Harry Truman and who voted Democratic even up to Bill Clinton, but they are now so angry and they believe that this government is terrible because it does not want to help them when it can. And I think if there was a song to describe it, it would be the song Winchester Cathedral, about when my baby left town, and the operative phrase was, you could have done something, you didn't do nothing when my baby left town. So I think here's the paradox. We have people who vote for anti-government elected officials because they believe the government could help them and didn't. And the more they vote for the anti-government elected officials, the less likely it is the government will help them. And the reason I say that is if you're a philosophical conservative, you want to cut back on Social Security and Medicare, you don't like the minimum wage, you don't want a lot of aid to kids to go to college, you don't want taxing the wealthy. On all of the specific issues, paradoxically, I believe the more liberal position is popular. Raising the minimum wage, raising taxes on the wealthy, although it's interesting. 15 years ago, frustratingly to many of us, the estate tax was unpopular. You talked about doing away with the estate tax. That's changed. People are now so angry about inequality. So we have a situation where we have popular specific programs, but you can't do any of them because they cost money. And this is what brings me to my solution. I believe, given the philosophical views and the cause, by the way, I should go back. What happened to these people? Why did their relative economic position erode? It was largely because of what happened to the world economy. After World War II ended, America dominated the world economically because every economy in the world but ours had been devastated by World War II. We suffered enormous personal loss, but our economy got stronger. From 1945 to well into the 70s, we made everything and could sell everything anywhere in the world. So that if you were a working class guy without an education, but you're willing to work, and you were a white male because of prejudices, you could go to work in the automobile factories, in the glass factory, in the steel factory, in the rubber factories. You could go make something and make a decent living because America could make everything everywhere. And unfortunately, from our standpoint, inevitably and fortunately overall, the rest of the world was catching up. So by the 70s, other parts of the world, Europe, Japan, could also make things. In some cases, they can make them cheaper than us. And the oil-producing countries stepped up, and they were beginning to get the value of their oil. So by the mid-70s, that American advantage was eroding. And it came out of the hide of the unskilled workers. That is, America continued to have a good economic advantage in the high-skilled areas. High technology developed, entertainment, American movies, to go back to my old partner, Chris Dodd, make a lot of money for America. So this became a split in the American economy. Up till the mid-'70s, everybody in America was doing good. But by the mid-'70s, the rest of the world caught up. So in America now, there was kind of a global division of labor. And America thrived in high-end stuff, but we didn't do so good in low-end stuff. I do believe there was one public policy mistake that liberals made, and that was the unthinking embrace of free trade without realizing that free trade does two things. It enhances the overall wealth of the nation, but it does it in a way that exacerbates an unequal distribution. And I'm very pleased to see that first-rate economists like Paul Krugman now acknowledge that. And my point with President Obama on the Pacific Trade Partnership was not that he shouldn't do it, but that he should only do it after he secured agreement from the Republicans who were for it, that we would raise the minimum wage and restore the role of labor unions and do some other things that would offset the unfair distributive impact. But at any rate, the failure of government didn't cause the problems, the international economy did. One of the mistakes that we make, understandable for people, is to take an exception as the norm. That period from 1945 into the mid-'70s, where America had this worldwide economic dominance, was an exception brought about by World War II. People assumed it was the norm and then blamed the government because we kind of lived up to it. At any rate, I now believe, what do you do about diminishing inequality? First, we could reduce the medical care costs that people bear. One simple way, reduce Medicare age to 55. Give people the chance to start getting out from under the private costs at that age. Make it much easier for people to go to college, not just community college. Increased financial aid. Put people to work on infrastructure. It is ridiculous. An example of the extremism of the current Republicans is that they think Dwight Eisenhower was way too radical, because Eisenhower had this radical idea that the federal government should build highways to improve on a national economic system suitable for a national economy. Many of these people literally think that we should turn the highway system back over to the states. And I guarantee you, I have been involved at the state and local level. Many of you have been too. If the states are in charge of mapping out the highways, they will not meet. I guarantee you that. Think about it. There will be there will be a lot of bypasses and connecting roads, because there is nothing that says that adjacent states will decide to have the road hit the same point. Putting people to work in construction, building the infrastructure. We talk about improving our productivity. Nothing does more for our productivity than improving our transportation system. Hours lost when goods can't move quickly, when people can't get to work. At the same time, you put people to work, and you put people to work who are not highly skilled technically, but are willing to work hard. And unlike when we first did construction, there have been some good social changes. So you no longer have only white guys doing construction. There is now a much more significant presence of women and racial minorities, and that can increase. So if we had enough money to get a massive highway, public transit, rail construction program, we would improve our productivity and put a lot of people to work and diminish inequality. I can go on and on and on. There are a series of things that would be popular if the only reason we can't do them is we don't have the money to do them. We don't have the money to do them in part because we can't raise taxes to do them, even raising the gasoline tax, which should be more easily done, because people hate the government and they don't believe the government will use the money well. So how do you get out of the vicious cycle? How do you get out of the situation where people hate the government because it won't do anything, and then vote for people who make sure the government won't do anything? The answer is find some money somewhere that allows you to implement programs that make higher education more available to people, that put people of non-technical skills to work in infrastructure, that improve public employment. There are good jobs for people to work, middle-class people to work, and working-class people to work in various ways in the public sector. Put more money publicly into healthcare and reduce the cost of healthcare. Build more rental housing for lower-income people, which then helps everybody, because when you add to the housing supply, you take some of the pressure off rental costs that are going up everywhere. So if we had I'm convinced of this, if I suddenly had $100 billion a year at the federal level that I could spend on these programs, within a couple of years, I could have a twofer. I could improve the quality of our life because all these things are good, and it would make a lot of people much more appreciative of government. The problem now is even where people believe in government in general, they get angry at it. The best example of that is a recent crisis we had at the Department of Veterans Affairs. Now, by the way, the Veterans Affairs Department, formerly the Veterans Administration, it provides medical care. And there is something very interesting, there are two interesting things about the medical care it provides. First, it is the most popular medical care in the country according to the consumers. Veterans are more satisfied in general with their VA medicine than any other group of customers. Secondly, it is socialized medicine. It's not even government health medicine like Medicare. If you go to a VA hospital, you go and park your car in a government lot, and you go in a government building, and a government doctor tells a government nurse to stick a government needle in your ass. It is government. And the people like it. In fact, when we were doing healthcare, what we were told was, don't you interfere with the VA. Don't let the government get involved with VA medicine. And people became angry about the VA a year ago. And you know why they were angry? There wasn't enough of it. The waiting lines were too long. We didn't give them enough money to hire enough people. And so what Congress did, Republicans joined in on this, was to give them billions of dollars more, forget the deficit, throw that money at the VA, and it became popular again. So give me $100 billion and the right president, and I believe you could begin to break this anti-government cycle. So that's where the question is. And I believe that that's a prerequisite for restoring citizenship, a prerequisite for having people who respect government, who believe with John Kennedy that you should, to some extent, ask what you can do for your country. For people who see the value of voting and electing people, the prerequisite for that is that they see government as a positive instrument. And there is one way, or there are two ways to do that. The more important, and that's why I said, doing what I just talked about is incompatible with the notion that was promulgated by some good liberal Democrats, people I agree with, although the Republicans are worse. Madeleine Albright said, America must be the indispensable nation, by which she meant that if there is trouble anywhere in the world, America must go to the rescue of the beleaguered. It is a noble sentiment with which I disagree for two reasons. The point is this. I believe we could find that $100 billion easily within a couple of years by reducing America's military budget so it was still by far the largest in the world, still larger than any conceivable combination of enemies, but not by as much. We don't have to be as big as we are. You know, of course, that the United States Air Force is the biggest air force in the world. Do people here know what is today the second biggest air force in the world? It is the United States Navy. Now, China's growing, but they're still third. On the assumption that the Navy and the Air Force will not go to war, we could probably reduce one or the other. We have three ways. I don't like Putin. I'm very glad that my grandparents got the hell out of there. And he's a bad guy. But he does not have anything like the capacity the old Soviet Union had militarily to threaten us. We still have three ways of destroying the Soviet Union with nuclear weapons. The nuclear submarines that are MIRV missiles, the Strategic Air Command, and intercontinental ballistic missiles. I have a modest proposal in Swiftian terms, John Swift, to the Pentagon. You know the three ways we have of destroying the Soviet Union? Pick two. Give up one. It would probably be intercontinental ballistic missiles. We'd still have these MIRV missiles on the submarines. We'd still have the stealth bombers, and that would save us billions of dollars a year. Let's say to eat Western Europe. You know what? Well, again, Putin's a nasty guy. You together, Western Europe, you are bigger and richer and stronger than Russia. And if you're worried about a military problem, why don't you spend a little money and have a military that can defend yourselves? Look, I'm ready to forgive Germany to this extent. Obviously, they did unspeakable things during World War II. I don't believe that that was inherent in the German race. I do believe it was a product of terrible circumstances. At this point, 70 years after World War II ended, I am prepared to stop punishing Germany. And you know how we punish them today? We insist on spending all the money that they need for defense out of our pockets instead of theirs. I'm ready to let Germany rearm, to be honest with you. Japan, too. I don't think they're inherently bad people. And we are spending tens of billions of dollars a year protecting them. Now, I have to say that we are protecting them more than they need to be protected. I don't think that the Western Europeans really face a military threat from the Russians. And I'll tell you how to make them feel safer. We announced that we are pulling our troops out. We give them 3 years and we say, we're pulling our troops out. And if you're worried about the Russians, you build up your own troops. The answer will be they'll decide they're not that worried about the Russians. And they won't build up their own troops, and we'll save an awful lot of money. So, I mean, and then of course you get the Middle East and the military intervention. Here's the, I think, fundamental point I've given a lot of thought. We have the best military in the history of the world, trained and equipped. They can do as well as any military has ever conceived of doing what a military can do. They can stop bad things from happening. They're very good at stopping bad things from happening. Our mistake is to think that they can make good things happen, particularly in societies very different than ours, where the problems are not physical, where the problem is physical aggression from the outside. Our military may have a role. Where the problem is bitter, internecine, intra-religious, sectarian, ethnic civil wars, our military has no role. I've rethought one area where I think I was probably wrong. I think George H.W. Bush did the right thing when he sent American troops into Kuwait to expel Saddam Hussein, because what he did was tell Hussein, you get out of Iraq, you get out of Kuwait, and then we're getting out too. That's one thing. The problem is when you intervene in a civil war. We have intervened in civil wars in Afghanistan. I was for going in and getting Osama bin Laden. That's over. We are now involved in civil wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and there are people who want us to get involved in civil wars in Syria. Here's the problem. We're being asked to get involved in civil wars because the side that we prefer to the other side seems to be losing. I said, people said, well, we got to go help the good guys against the bad guys. No, we're being asked to help the not so bad guys against the worst guys in many of those cases. But here's the problem. If you intervene in a civil war where there's no external aggression, and you intervene in a civil war where the side you prefer is losing, what reason is there to think that as soon as you pull out, they're not going to lose again? We don't transform the situation. So what they're talking about is an indefinite military presence in Iraq and Afghanistan. I just saw General Petraeus, a great general, but there's a political decision. He wants us to send American advisors into Syria to help them. I have talked to the Americans. You know what the American advisors do? They go out with the people they're advising and join them in shooting the other guy. What do? You're an advisor at a combat level. You stand there and say, oh, no, aim higher. No, you don't. You shoot too. They're shooting at you. I mean, we are greatly overextended in the Middle East. President Obama was right to withdraw. I wish he was more willing to resist some of the pressures to go back in. And by the way, here's one of the things that makes me feel good. I think the public's on our side on these things. Even those Republicans who are talking about forcing the president to do more, they have not put up any legislation to do that. They don't want to put that to a vote. The president asked for some authority to do some bombing legislatively. They said, oh, no, that's not enough. We're not going to pass it. Well, why don't they amend it to give more? Because they know it's unpopular. So I will repeat, I believe we could reduce by $100 billion a year, you phase it in. And politically, I understand it's very difficult where a weapons system is already being built to cut it off because people have the jobs. Fine, let's just not build a lot of new ones. You know, I'm willing to waste a little money on some of these things that we probably don't need because it would be politically difficult to stop it. But if we began today to scale America's military to where it needed to be, we'd be okay. And by the way, here's the historic explanation of how we got here and why we can get back. America was never a big military power. We scaled up for the Nazis. And from 1941 to 1991, There were bad people in the world, heavily armed bad people, the Nazis and the communists, who were an existential threat to us. I think communism faded a little before, but they were still there. As of 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, there was no threat in the world to America's continued existence as a free society. And as a result, first George H.W. Bush and then Bill Clinton began to cut the military. If you watch the Republican debate, you heard John Kasich on a couple of occasions boast that he balanced the budget when he was chairman of the Budget Committee. He's right. He forgets to mention that he was only able to do it with the partnership of Bill Clinton. And even more interestingly, he announces that he did balance the budget, but in 2000, when he left office, budget balancing ended. Yeah, so did Clinton, and Bush came in, and they unbalanced the budget, and the budget was balanced for two reasons. We raised taxes on the wealthy, and we reduced military spending. We began to put it down. So military spending was on the downward trend. And the great triumph of Dick Cheney, with George Bush being the enabler, was to build up these murderous terrorists to the level of being the kind of existential threat to our existence that the communists and the Nazis were. And the terrorists are terrible people, and I cheer when they are killed. But you know what? Nuclear submarines don't help you beat terrorists. I wish they did, because they don't have any. We have a lot. I mean, if all this expensive weaponry was in any way relevant to defeating terrorism, the fight would have been over. What we need to say is, yes, we need to fight these people, and you fight them in effective ways, but it does not require this $500 billion military budget, 500 and climbing, and it does not require, in fact, it doesn't do very much good to get involved in some of these civil wars. We make it more likely rather than less likely that they're going to attack us. So my first point is that we should, and I believe again, that there's a lot of support across the spectrum in America. This is one where I think the voters are ahead of the public, as much as the voters annoy me sometimes. I believe a president who says, I want to cut this back will win. Now, I'm a supporter of Hillary Clinton. She's not going to go as far as I like, but I am looking forward to this. In the next presidential election, I believe she'll be the nominee, and she'll be facing a Republican who wants to do more, and she will be successful. Historically, Democrats running for president, ever since George McGovern, were warned that they better look like they're tough in defense of America or they will lose. And that's why everybody who was running for president voted for the Iraq War. John Kerry, as well as Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden, they all voted for it. Barack Obama in 2012 was the first Democrat running for president who explicitly talked about less military spending against a Republican talking about more, and we won. You may remember when Mitt Romney attacked him because the Navy had fewer ships than before. And he very effectively pointed out that, yes, we did have fewer ships. We also had fewer cavalry horses and bayonets. The technology was involved. In fact, the Democrats were afraid we were going to lose Virginia, because Virginia, at any given time, there are more warships in Virginia, where they build them, than in almost any other country in the world. And we carried Virginia, despite that. I think the public is ready for this. They're certainly ready for what we call burden sharing, telling them to do this. I don't think further military engagement in the Middle East is popular. So that would get us $100 billion. Second, so that's why I believe it. And what it means is this, and it's acknowledging, I should add this. If I thought some of these military interventions actually relieve terrible problems elsewhere, I would be morally torn, because I am convinced the prerequisite for being able to turn around this anti-government feeling, which in turn is the prerequisite for doing anything substantial to improve the quality of our lives at home. We are at a kind of frustrated point now. If we want to do anything to make the lives of most Americans better, diminishing inequality among those, then we've got to reduce the anti-government feelings, and we can only do that if we reduce this military spending. So what if I had to choose between reducing military spending and that would mean doing damage overseas? And the answer is no. Most of the military spending I'm talking about is either A, irrelevant, like beating the Soviet Union in a thermonuclear war, or does more harm than good, counterproductive. Intervening militarily in internal disputes in societies where people hate each other And our military cannot end corruption in Afghanistan. And I don't blame the individuals, but I'm sure, I know it was in the New York Times, I assume it was in other papers, that American military personnel in Afghanistan were told that when our Afghan allies in their presence are sexually abusing young boys, that they have to ignore it, because those are deeply rooted cultural traditions in Afghanistan. I understand the difficulty of trying by sending our military in to change their traditions. That's an argument for not sending the military in, because we can't really do much about this. I wish it were the case. It does appear there the eagerness to fight of some of the people that we most dislike in the Middle East is greater than their enemies. I regret that. I feel sorry for the people over there. I don't think we can change it without, even, not just without, even with a massive ongoing military occupation. It's not going to work. So I can avoid that moral dilemma. I can avoid the moral dilemma of saying, oh, I want to improve healthcare and diminish inequality at home because I don't want to spend the money overseas. I don't want to spend the money overseas even if I couldn't spend it here, because I don't think it does much good. There's a second place, and I'm going to open this up for questions, but that's the why I think it costs a lot of money to be the indispensable nation, and it doesn't bring us much. We do it for prestige. We do it because we want people to think better of us. Let them, I mean, I'm sorry if other people or countries don't like us, but so what? I mean, I'll quote my mother now, when I would complain that somebody said something rude about me, she would say in a kind of semi-Yiddish, so let them call you Pisha. What do you care? Let them say a bad word about you. We have this view that America somehow must be the leader of the world. Why do we have to be the leader of the world? We should defend ourselves. We should go to the aid of vulnerable people who are being attacked by outsiders. But why does America have to be the leader of the free world? And by the way, it's not just the free world, because it includes Saudi Arabia, some other places that are not so free. But I mean, let's be the most important country in the world and the most heavily armed country in the world, but not by a factor of 4 or 5 over the nearest competitor, or 2 or 3 even. And let's not insist on this. I believe that this is an easy trade-off. Stop spending this money militarily. We'll continue to be the strongest military in the world, and we'll have more at home. There is a secondary source, and I will just mention it, that has a dual benefit. I think it is time to stop locking people up because they sniff, swallow, or inject themselves with things of which we disapprove. I think we should ban the ingestion of substances in one class of cases. That is, you should not be taking substances that are going to immediately render you necessary for us to take you to the hospital and spend that money. I mean, drinking some of this stuff. But more importantly, we should be able to restrict you taking things that clearly make you more likely to injure other people. And there's one exception to that. There is obviously a substance in America that does make people much more likely to injure other people, but it's too late to ban alcohol, which is the substance that most people take that's likeliest to lead in people injuring others. The notion of making it criminal for someone to smoke marijuana is really truly stupid. But I think that goes to cocaine and heroin. For one thing, even if you think it's terrible for people to take cocaine and heroin, nothing could be less effective in stopping them in the current system. And it would also have a great crime reducer. People do not rob other people because they use heroin. They rob other people because they want to use heroin and need the money. It also has the advantage of dealing with what has now become identified as a problem, although it was a long-standing problem, and that is unfair law enforcement against African Americans. And by the way, I do not believe that there is a greater instance of African Americans being abused by police officers. What we have is less willingness to tolerate that, more willingness to speak up against it, and more of a supportive base if you do. But I think it is very clear, unfair, racially prejudicial enforcement of the law is worse in the area of drug use than any other. It was actually formally enacted in the law with the distinction in penalties between crack and powdered cocaine, crack being used more by black people, powder by white people. But the arrests for these low-level drug users are an example of racism in action. And if you stop doing this, you save a lot of money. You stop police arresting them and them going to court and then imprisoning them. I cannot think of anything dumber than imprisoning people because we don't like the substance they took. And by the way, you know, sometimes people say, well, do it more cheaply. That's the problem. Government's too inefficient. And I've been asked, how come it costs more money to send someone to prison in Massachusetts than to the state university? And there's a very simple explanation. Very few people try to escape from the state university. And when you are confining people against their will, 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, it costs more money than giving them a lecture or even with a big laboratory. So that's my view. I believe that the American people on the whole are angry at government because it has failed to deliver to them the things government should deliver, particularly those in the economic segment who have suffered as a result of global economic trends and are the victims of increased inequality, and believe government could diminish that. I agree with them. There are things government do. There are still some economic trends, but government could diminish inequality, but only if we were able to get the political support for these public programs. And the only way to do that is to make more resources available to the government, reducing military spending, saying goodbye to indispensability, admitting that there will be cases in the world where we will be completely and totally irrelevant, and we will feel sympathy for people, but couldn't help them if we wanted to, and therefore shouldn't spend a lot of money trying to. That's the solution, and I believe that's the key to getting back to effective citizenship. Once people again recognize government as a positive source of value in their lives, we won't have to encourage them to go and try and take it over. Thank you.
So I just want to make a quick announcement that that Mr. Frank will take questions, and we have someone with a microphone. We ask that you use the microphone and identify yourself. And I also want to remind you that Mr. Frank will be signing books in the lobby afterwards.
I may, if you only have one mic, I may just repeat the question if I can hear it. So why don't we start with that? You can get to the mic if you can, but so yes, go over there in the back. Yeah, ma'am. You who just turned your head saying, who, me? You, the answer is yes, you.
Thank you very much. My name's Lara Pawson, and I'm from, you can probably tell from my accent, I'm from the UK. And I'm just here for a few days giving a lecture at UNC. I was a little bit late, so I may have missed something that you said earlier. And I actually only heard of you today. I watched a video of you telling someone that they sounded like a dining table. So I really hope you don't think that I do sound like a dining table. I thought you sounded fantastic. But when you were talking about the sort of the failure of American citizens to engage in government, I suppose what I felt seemed to be missing from your discussion, which surprised me, and I'd just like to hear your views on this, is the role of business and big finance. I mean, it's all very well.
Let me respond.
Okay.
If the question is, look, I am very angry at the Supreme Court decision that opened the flood of money. I have to say, though, in part, this phenomenon I'm talking about is a worldwide phenomenon, or at least a democratic nation phenomenon. You know, it's not just Donald Trump who gets all the support. The growth of votes for nihilistic parties in Western Europe has been also discouraging. No, I believe that the big money exacerbates that trend, but it's not causal. And in fact, it starts back with Ronald Reagan. The movement of white working class men to vote for people who don't believe in government goes back 20 years and more. It gets more progressive. And that predates this flood of money. So I do think the money is a problem. I hope, look, the next president of the United States is going to get to appoint Supreme Court justices. There were 4 Supreme Court justices close to right around the age of 80. Assuming the next president serves 8 years, which is more often than not the case, in the term of the next president, there will be appointments of enough justices to change the balance on a number of issues, including financial reform. And if the President of the United States elected in 2016 gets the power to appoint these justices, I believe she will appoint people who will turn this around, and we will be better off. But I mean, that's, so I agree that they've exacerbated it, but they haven't caused it. Okay, the question is, what role does gerrymandering play? Well, obviously, it exacerbates the near-term advantage for the gerrymanderers. And here's the problem. One of the worst things that happened to government, for me, there were things that are serendipitous. It was the governors and legislatures elected in 2010 that got to do the redistricting, because that's what happens under our Constitution. If it had been those elected in either 2008 or 2012, it would have been a different story. That's the problem. I don't think, again, that that's causal of what I'm talking about, but it is an exacerbating factor. It makes it even harder. This is a difficult constitutional question. The Supreme Court has consistently held, obviously, that if there is a clear racial bias in the gerrymandering, they can step in. Otherwise, they can't. Although even there, and well, let me say this, there was one other thing the Supreme Court did that made this worse, and that was the outrageous decision to gut the Voting Rights Act. That was one of the worst things ever done. It was outrageous by their own doctrines. Basically, what they said was, oh, Congress, you got that one wrong. You made a bad judgment. We'll substitute our judgment, which these judicial restraint people are not supposed to want to do. So gerrymandering, again, is a case that exacerbates it. But it's not well, let's put it this way. What happened was that the people elected in 2010 got the power to redistrict and hurt us. But the phenomenon I'm talking about is why they got the power to do that in 2010. It's that anger, that's why they won the 2010 election. Yes? Would you stand up, please? Thank you.
I want to talk about the class white men, and considering that you describe this group with characteristic, I wonder if you think it's possible that it's more than just economic alienation, but also some cultural alienation that's...
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. I say white men, are they only upset economically? I do think resentment at what they think is preferential treatment for women and minorities comes into it. But it's a secondary explanation. That is, if they had good jobs, they wouldn't worry about it. They do believe that one of the reasons they don't have the good jobs is that blacks and women have them. So I agree. But again, that, you know, if there were enough jobs for everybody, that would be less of a problem. So that is, again, an aggravating factor. On the other hand, I'm not sure as much. Look, there were books written. A guy named Thomas Frank, no relation, wrote a book, What's the Matter with Kansas? And he said the reason that white working class people vote conservative are the social issues. Well, one of the social issues that was supposed to have done that was LGBT rights. It is now very clear that's not true at all. The fact is that, no, they weren't voting right-wing because they were afraid of gay people. Because this anti-government trend, this trend of people voting more conservative, has coexisted with a great and substantial and ongoing increase in support for LGBT rights. So I think it is less the social issues, it's the economic issue. But I do agree that you then get the secondary view that one of the reasons the government's not helping them is that it's only helping blacks and women. Yeah.
Comment on
Take the mic, Joe.
what?
Mike.
The mic, well, where is it? Okay. Hi. I'm wondering if you could comment on what seems to me to be the press of the Republican frontrunners to use scapegoats of the immigrants and other communities. I think this is a dangerous move, but I hope the danger is primarily that it's going to undercut the interest of those
I
same
think in this
communities to
case,
vote.
in this case, this is one that politically damages them, and sensible Republicans understand that. Between Carson and Trump, and they're now angering Hispanics, Muslims. Jeb Bush managed to throw in Asians by saying he meant Chinese anchor babies. Yeah, I am not worried about that. And by the way, that is a major issue. The ones most worried about that are the business community. The business community in America understands the value of immigration. By the way, there was just this, what economists call, and maybe some economists here, the lump of labor fallacy. The notion that at any given time in a society, there are only a certain number of jobs. And if more people come in, they will take some of the jobs away from the existing people. What that forgets is that the people who come in are two kinds of people economically. They are people who get jobs, and then they are people who buy things from the people who get jobs. And immigrants, in fact, also consume. From the Social Security standpoint, by the way, illegal immigrants are one of the minor strengths of that system. Because what happens is people get fake Social Security numbers, they work, their money is deducted for Social Security, and they never get it. They contribute to Social Security with no chance of, so I think that's gonna hurt them rather than others. And the Pope helps a little bit with that. But I think sensible Americans understand that hurts them, and you will see them. I mean, I don't think Trump or Freeman, I don't think any of them are going to be the nominee. And I do think that one of the reasons other Republicans are now feeling they got to fight back against Trump is their understanding that he is hurting them with Hispanic Americans and other non-whites, Asians as well. I mean, look, that goes back to '96. Bill Clinton, who was a great political analyst, pointed out the Republicans began their anti-immigrant stuff in the '90s, and Bill Clinton said in one conversation that I was in that he is the first Democrat to get a majority of the Asian vote in America in a long time. One, because a lot of the Asian Americans were from Indochina, where there was a fierce anti-communism. There was a kind of a conservatism among them. And so I think that's just very counterproductive. And it'll never get to be public policy, it'll just burn out. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Castell Preston, and my question is, how do you think the non-governmental organizational aspect and sector affects your plan for, government filling in some of the gaps that people have?
Well, it's very helpful if we get the resources. I think, and non-governmental organizations do a great deal. And non-governmental organizations can do a great deal to improve the quality of life. They cannot take on the quantity of life. That is, they are very effective transmission mechanisms if the government provides the resources. But it is a mistake to think that private charity is going to do this. When people tell me that private charity can take care of the needs of the poor, I'm pretty sure these are people who've never been involved with private charity. So it is important to have the non-governmental organizations. They can do some things that politically might be too difficult for the government. They are very good delivery systems for the resources that can only come from an adequately funded government. Yeah. Say that, but I'll repeat it. Go ahead. Go ahead, I'll repeat your question. But never mind me.
My name is Arrow Wexler. You assert that if you had $100 billion or thereabouts, that would make a difference to the poor, the unemployed, the disenfranchised in this country. I ask you, over the last 40 years, 50 years, the amount of money that has been spent on social programs dwarfs that 100 billion. Yep. Their lot has not improved.
Wrong. One of the things we have done with social programs, for example, is get rid of poverty among the elderly. The time period you're talking about is basically Medicare. Medicare, which has spent a very large amount of money, has made an enormous improvement in the lives of a group of poor people, the elderly. There was much less hunger in America today because of food stamps. The notion that that money has done no good is, I think, a mistake. It has been pulling against a tide. Also, when you say hundreds of billions in social welfare, I'm not sure which programs you talk about. Money to the very poor has been fairly small. I think food stamps have played a major role in diminishing hunger in this country, and I think that has been very helpful. I think, and again, I'm not talking, but and I think you hear me through your filter. I talked about infrastructure. Is that a social welfare program by your definition? I talked specifically, I thought I was fairly clear, that one of the things I would do would be to spend more money building roads, improving rail transportation, improving public transportation. You certainly don't consider that to be social welfare. Well, that's a major source of spending that I would do that would give jobs to middle class. You're waving. What is God going to tell you? Go ahead. Respond. How did I misrepresent you?
Will be and have been in the same lower segment of society.
Who's they?
The people who need the work, the food stamps, the benefit from construction jobs. They have nowhere to go. This is simply dangling something of short.
You don't think if we substantially increase construction work, that would not help people who are currently unemployed who can do construction? I don't understand your point. We could put people to work at very good wages in the construction area, talking about spending tens of billions of dollars over the next few years. And that's not going to make the people get those jobs better off to you? How is it not making them better off? If they are unemployed now, we're not trying to get a job, and they go and get a job. How is it not making them better off if we make it possible? Let me ask you this. Do you think there are people who could benefit from a college education who can't now afford it? Do you think there are a significant number of people in this society who could benefit from higher education but cannot now afford to get it? Let me give you, excuse me, sir, let me suggest two possible ones. Yes and no. I'm sorry, but I think you really can't tell, you really are not prepared to agree that there are currently people in this society who could benefit from a higher education who can't afford it? You will not agree to that?
I will not.
Good. Then we're through. We're through.
And I'll tell you why.
Go ahead.
I'll tell you why. Because today, that college education is sharply diminished in its value.
Okay, do you think sharply diminished means the same as absolutely extinguished? Yes, it is diminished in some ways, but there is still, by every measure, some value. So, first of all, you contradicted yourself, because you do agree that there are people, you think, I'm sorry, in your view, there is no economic benefit from higher education today, and therefore, it's irrelevant that people can't afford it. Is that a fair statement of your views?
I would say it's uncertain.
Okay. I will agree with you that apparently there are limits to what an education can do for people.
Thank you for coming. Thank you for your talk. My name is Richard Chady, and there's been a lot of outrage right now about a young man who has become known as Pharma Bro. And he substantially raised the price of a drug, to increase his profits.
Yeah, Shkreli.
Yes. And there are other drugs that are very expensive. And do you think, does this create an opening to finally face this issue about the cost and the availability of prescription drugs?
One of the problems, this is the guy who bought that company and sent it way up. Shkreli is his name. I welcome that, and I think the reaction to that is going to be good. The people are on the defensive about it. One thing we should be able to do, when George Bush increased the Medicare entitlement to cover drugs, he made a deal that they would not allow the federal government to bargain with the drug companies through Medicare. The federal government bargains with the drug companies for the Veterans Affairs Department and elsewhere. We would save a lot of money if we were able to bargain with them. And I think this is going to be helpful in getting that done. People will also be looking at any possible legal obstacles. One of the problems is when drugs go off patent and this drug is off patent, but apparently there's some obstacles to doing it generically, they may get eliminated. But I think you will see ways, both Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton are talking about this. And that includes, from my standpoint, being able to import drugs from Canada. one of the arguments we're told is that we can't import drugs from Canada because it wouldn't be safe. And well, that's one of the main arguments. I will tell you, the day I read about a lot of dead Canadians who took flawed drugs, I will believe that. By the way, there's an element of this that's related to my argument about our unfairly carrying the defense burden. The American medical consumer is paying the cost of drug development for everybody else in the world. These are drugs that are much cheaper everywhere else. And I think we have finally broken that. Now, here's one of the reasons President Obama has been very good on stuff. He has not until now taken on the question of drug pricing because he understandably made a deal with the pharmaceutical companies that they would not oppose healthcare. And it may have been the right deal to make. I was busy with other stuff. But literally, there was an explicit agreement. So the pharmaceutical industry did not oppose and to some extent supported the bill. Of course, they should have supported their own interest because they sell a lot more drugs when people have money to pay for them. But I believe that you're exactly right, and this is one of those things that will have a real impact. And even with the Republicans in Congress, I think you're going to see some legislation go forward that they will be afraid to break. And I think others in the industry, having gotten that message, are now going to be telling him, I guess he's backing down a little bit. People are now saying, oh, geez, we better calm down. Yeah.
Several Supreme Court rulings which you strongly oppose, rightly so, I would say.
Oh, I'm all for it. The question is, how do I evaluate the Supreme Court's right to overturn legislation as unconstitutional in a democratic society? And I think the answer is democracy has to include respect for minority rights, and that if you had no enforcement mechanism on minority rights, we would be worse off. The other thing I would say is this, and it's a democratic defense in this way. In those cases when the Supreme Court has made decisions that clearly violate what people think, they do tend to get overturned. They get overturned by later appointments, et cetera. So I understand there is some sacrifice in democracy, but I do think that, and occasionally they will go too far and get into a policy area. But in general, I think protection for minority rights is very important, and that's done by the court. Yes. In the middle of a region, policy which rests squarely on what you want to cut.
In fact, it's the only industrial policy the United States has, which is to spend money on industrial output for defense. Otherwise, everybody's against industrial policy. What sayest thou to that?
Well, I don't think that's true. It's not only defense. For example, the federal government spends a lot of money on drugs, and and drug research has also been a support for.
No, I understand. I'm talking about those things that create the kind of broad-based jobs.
Yeah, I think
you're in a place in which everything we have was created by national industrial policy, and most of the people who are against that sort of thing refuse to know their own history. Well, let's just start with right now.
I understand that, and I'm saying this. First place, I'm not prepared to have the whole country subsidize your region by wasting money on troops in Germany. Well, let me go back a step. Much of what we spend is irrelevant to what you say. You're talking about research and development. Troops in Germany and Japan do not contribute to the economy of this triangle. Intercontinental ballistic missiles in silos, wherever the hell they are in Nebraska, make no contribution. I do not think you benefit from the war in Iraq. Now, I do understand there are some issues on the research, and I would say this. I believe if we were able to make some cuts, that you would then have economic support for federally subsidized activity in other areas. But it's also the case that much of the money you benefit from, go back through the list of what I talked about. I don't think I touched on anything that's being spent here. Remember, with my $100 billion cut, staying out of Iraq and dealing with the nuclear weapons, et cetera, building airplanes, none of that touches you. We have an awful lot we can deal with. We then do have to confront the issue is, do you spend money that has no good end justification because of the benefits of doing it? And maybe you do, but I think you could then broaden the purposes for which you do it. Yeah.
My name's Tom Gray. I'm from Carborough, and I wondered what your sense of the tea leaves of this coming election are. Do you think it's generally going to be a more progressive outcome or more regressive outcome?
I'm baffled by the Republican side. I'll tell you, I thought a few months ago Scott Walker could be a tough candidate. I didn't realize, of course, how inept he was, how inarticulate he is. And I have been surprised at how inarticulate Jeb Bush is. I do believe that the candidate at this point it's not going to be Donald Trump. It's not going to be Ben Carson. It's probably not going to be Carly Fiorina. I think the Republicans, they may nominate one of the more plausible people, but he will come to that nomination very burdened by all the anger over immigration and by a very right-wing platform that you're going to have. On the other side, I believe Hillary Clinton will be, and it should be the Democratic nominee. Let me say, I know people have asked me, well, why am I not for Bernie Sanders? Because does he not, particularly say in the military area, and in going for higher taxes right away, agree more with some of the positions I've taken? I would say, first of all, Hillary Clinton is a very solid liberal. And if I thought everything she was for could be accomplished in the first term, I would be thrilled. Yeah, I would go a little further than she, but unfortunately, there's no great chance for that. But secondly, when people ask me why, if you agree with Bernie Sanders on all those issues, are you not for him? That's precisely why. If I thought you could hold the positions that Bernie Sanders and I tend to hold on a lot of these issues and be elected president of the United States, I would not be supporting Bernie Sanders. I would be running. And look, I know there was some allusion to my temperament, and I will agree that I have been grumpy from time to time, but Bernie makes me look like Happy the Dwarf. I do think Hillary Clinton is currently getting pounded by the press, and this is part of the media. The media decided that since there wasn't any other plausible opponent to Hillary Clinton, they would have to be. That's turned out not to be as much the case because Sanders has done better. But I believe this with regard to the emails. They're hitting her on them now. After a couple of more months, if, as I expect, no specific email will surface that in any way compromises or reflects negatively on her, that no national security violation existed, no corruption, nothing, that the fact that she used the wrong email server when we get to a campaign in which we're talking about climate change and abortion and the role of unions, et cetera, that it will tend to go away. So I am inclined to be optimistic that she will be elected president. And I don't know what, I mean, I guess there is the one Republican who seems to me who could offset that would be John Kasich, although I think he has a very hard time getting nominated in that party. And Kasich, that would be tougher because but this is the Republican's dilemma. Everything that makes Kasich a better November candidate makes him a less likely nominee. And anybody short of him, I think, comes burdened by so much. Look, Jeb Bush today apparently announced, trying to revive himself in the Republican Party, that one of the things he wants to do is to repeal the financial reform bill. I welcome that. I say two things about the financial reform bill, which is fairly complicated. No, I don't think there is general public understanding of all its specifics, and B, it's very popular. The notion that you're going to go back to deregulating derivatives and freeing J.P. Morgan Chase and Goldman Sachs from the oppressive government, I'd love him to run on that. I think we'll take one more. Yes, ma'am. No, please don't talk about Congress. The Republicans are. But I'm serious, so that's the problem. There is this tendency to say, oh, you know, it's kind of, oh, a plague on both their houses. But in fact, as I said, things were going okay with normal dispute until the right wing took over the Republican Party, and that's the problem. You know, I wrote an article for the Sunday Portland, Maine paper. People were complaining, well, there were not America lags in the number of women in Congress. They're only about 15%. Yeah, you know what that 15% consists of? 35% of the Democrats and 8% of the Republicans. I mean, there are very real differences between the parties. So I beg people, when you're talking about, there are two things I think people should not say anymore, two old sayings. One, do not say a plague on both your houses, because it is not an equality of problem. The other one, you didn't ask, but I'll volunteer it, was reinforced today. Do not say of someone that he is more Catholic than the Pope, because today most bishops think they are in fact more Catholic than the Pope, and that has lost a lot of its force. But I think the problem is the Republicans. And by the way, this is one area where the Pope is making an impact. That's going to hurt them as well. I think, and it hurts them with business people and moderates and reasonable independents. No, I mean, these are not people who worry as much as I wish they would about economic inequality or want to go to the defense of unions. But I think immigration and climate change are two of the issues that are going to have very damaging impact on the Republicans when it comes to Republican-leading independents, moderates, and business people. And most of the, you know, it's unfortunate one of the party difference. I will say this. There are Republicans who do understand the climate change issue. They are prevented by the dynamics of that party with its very right-wing primary voting base, either from acknowledging it or more, what you now see, the reasonable Republican position is to acknowledge that climate change is a problem, but put obstacles in the way of doing anything about it. Thank you.
Just a quick announcement that we will be having a book signing in the back in the lobby in just a few minutes. Thank you.